I'm James Redfield, and I teach Bible, Talmud, and other Jewish literature at St. Louis University and the University of Chicago Divinity School. This book is called From a Distant Relation, and will be appearing, Kanahora, with Syracuse University Press in December. It is an edition and translation of a collection of short literary pieces by Mikhah Yosef Berdichevsky, who was an influential and multifaceted writer and intellectual around the turn of the 20th century. He was born in Podolia in Ukraine in 1865 and died in Berlin in 1921. Berdichevsky was also a rather eccentric historian of ancient Judaism and Christianity, as well as a scholar who was steeped in rabbinic and Hasidic tradition. But today he is best known for two things. First, for his innovations in Hebrew prose style, which he made more mythological and romantic, both more inward focused and richer in symbolism. And second, for his polemic with the Chad Ha'am about modern Jewish identity around 1900. In standard narratives of this period in Jewish history, that is essentially how Berdichevsky is remembered, as one of the leading lights of his generation's struggle to break away from tradition and forge a culture of their own. In that regard, he is often associated with his friend, Joseph Chaim Brenner, with whom he collaborated in a literary circle known appropriately as the Young Ones. Also like Brenner, however, Berdichevsky never really lost his attachment to the tradition that he was supposedly breaking away from, and he expressed that attachment throughout all of his work. This is especially evident in a brief and neglected period of his life when he focused on Yiddish, a midlife crisis of sorts from 1902 to 1906, when he was settled in the city of Breslau, which was at that time in the German Empire and is now in Poland. During this period, he produced a substantial volume of short writings in Yiddish in various genres, from reviews and dramatic sketches to short stories and monologues. The latter, the short stories and monologues, a little bit less than half of his total Yiddish corpus, is selected in this book. In addition to the sheer enjoyment factor that the book hopefully provides, and many of the pieces do have this dark comedy to them, sort of overlooked side of Berdichevsky as well. In my introduction, as well as a foreword by the Israeli scholar Avner Holtzman of Tel Aviv University, we ask a deceptively simple question. Why Yiddish? And why Yiddish now, just when Berdichevsky was beginning to be so highly regarded as a modern Hebrew writer? I'll leave you in suspense about those questions, but let's just say, I hope, that between the front matter and the notes to each story, as well as the glossary, the map, and bibliographies, the book should provide enough resources for you to start exploring the question and hopefully teaching it with as much enjoyment as we had in putting it together. And now for a selection from the volume, the beginning of the story entitled, How Ben Natanson Got His Start. As a rule, if a young woman is engaged with a dowry of 300 ducats around the age of 15, then presumably her groom is a full-time Torah scholar. So her parents provide him with free room and board until he has a few small children and he matures into a proper adult. In the meantime, during his kest, when he doesn't so much as lift a finger and even his charitable donations are covered by his in-laws, he learns a bit of Gemara or ritual and civil law in the Shulchan Aruch, stays up all night learning every Thursday, and becomes part of the town's young elite. Involving himself in his father-in-law's business or other worldly concerns never once crosses his mind. Why should he take on such a burden earlier than absolutely necessary? Not that his father-in-law has any burning desire to involve the young man in his affairs. What does a boy like that, who can barely grow a beard, know about the real world? Give him money earmarked for a third party's transaction and he'll squander it right away. But 3 or 4 years after the wedding, when he does have those small children to think of, he must turn his attention to more practical matters. Not everyone can become a rabbi, after all. So be it. The young gentleman in the study house is now obliged to reinvent himself as a merchant. Only one question remains. What should he go into? Hog bristles? Leather? Skins? Furs? Should he open a shop? Lease a mill? He hems and haws, asks his father and father-in-law for advice. When all is said and done, the whole family is in feathers. So Yossel's son-in-law, Riven, the young man whom we've been talking about this entire time, of course, ends up going into feathers as well. Feathers. You buy them in Ledichev or somewhere nearby. You pack them into sacks. You drive them to the big city, Brody, where they pay good prices. And while you're there, you buy some other merchandise on the cheap. There are plenty of merchants in Ledichev who are already in feathers, of course, but that doesn't mean dear Riven shouldn't go into feathers as well. If the good Lord smiles upon you, he will provide. If 7 other Jews are already sitting in a tub and you clamber in, what happens to the water? It rises, doesn't it? As Riven was no expert in all this feathers business just yet, they set him up with his older brother-in-law, Chaim, who had plenty of experience. Chaim was already through with his test, like Riven. Like Riven, he used to learn Torah full time, and when he was hunched over his Gemara, people said the boy would never earn a penny. And now look at him, elbow deep in merchandise. Intelligence, that's what counts. Expose anyone with intelligence to the art of handling money and turning a profit, and you'll make a fine merchant of him soon enough. Now let me tell you how dear Riven, or Rivela as they called him, because he was the youngest of Reb Yosef's sons-in-law, cashed in his dowry and prepared to strike out on his own. First, he quit learning altogether. Then he started tallying up the dowry that had been withdrawn for him. But soon he began to wonder whether he had received everything that he was originally promised, and he disputed the sum with his father-in-law. Naturally, it irritated Reb Yosel that Riven would try to squeeze even more money out of him, but he said to himself, he'll make something of himself, that one. And when his wife Pessy gave him grief on the subject, how could he let someone like that say such a thing to him, someone who'd been eating his bread all these years, who was still no more than a boy, etc.? He growled, drop it, Pessy. Would you rather have a son-in-law who's a simpleton who thinks money grows on trees? You should know, dear reader, that Reb Yosel was already planning to retire and turn over everything to his sons-in-law. All he wanted was for his business to end up in good hands. When one begins to feel one's age, the time comes to take stock of what one will leave behind.